Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's panel discussion hosted by AHDB, the NSA and BGS. My name is Tom Goatman and I'm the CEO of BGS. Tonight we'll be focusing on how to successfully manage sheep on herbal leys. The decision to hold the session was directly the result of feedback received from an earlier series of webinars on herbal leys hosted by AHDB and BGS between July 2020 and March 2021. This series of webinars focused on delivering livestock performance and environmental improvements, establishment, considerations beyond the price tag, and feeding and grazing management. From these, we received specific requests to focus on sheep in more detail. Working together with AHDB, the NSA and BGS, are delighted to welcome an excellent panel of speakers to the discussion tonight. After introductions, there will be a series of short presentations followed by a Q&A session, where the panel will be happy to take any questions you may have around the points discussed. The webinar tonight will be recorded and the link made available. I'll now hand across to Chloe McKee from AHDB, who will be facilitating the webinar this evening to outline how it will be managed. Chloe.
Thank you, Tom, and good evening, everyone. I'll run through the housekeeping and facilitate the Q&A. For this webinar, you will all be muted, but we would like you to ask questions throughout using the questions box on the side of your screen. To find this box, click on the orange box with an arrow on the top right-hand side of your screen and press the questions drop-down box. All questions are anonymous, so please do ask anything, and also use this box to let us know if you're having any technical problems, and we'll do our best to help. The usual advice is to log out and come back in. So before we move on to the presentations, we'd like to introduce you to a poll this evening, and we'd be really interested to know how many plant species do you currently include in your leys? So I'll just launch that poll now. So hopefully you can see the poll on screen, and the options are not currently growing multi-species leys, growing 2 to 4 species, 4 to 6 species, or more than 6. I can see lots of votes coming in already, so that's brilliant. I'll just give everyone a few more seconds. Brilliant, thank you everyone. So the majority of listeners this evening are not growing multi-species leys, 40% growing 2 to 4 species and 13% 4 to 6. So we've definitely got something for everyone this evening. Thank you for voting. So I'll now hand over to Jan from the NSA, South East Regional Chairman, who will introduce our first speaker.
Good evening, everybody. Our first speaker this evening is Tommy Boland, Professor of Ruminant Nutrition and Sheep Production in the School of Agriculture and Food Sciences at University College Dublin. From a mixed farming background, Tommy's research focuses on enhancing the sustainability, of ruminant production systems, with his recent work revolving around the role of multi-species swards in dairy, beef and sheep systems. Tom and his wife Deirdre have 4 children who all, I'm delighted to read here, play an active role in his small sheep enterprise. So Tommy, over to you to kick off the evening on behalf of the topic, how to successfully manage sheep on herbal leys.
Thank you very much, Jan, and good evening, everybody. Can you see my slides? Great. So listen, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with you all this evening. And I'm going to discuss multi-species swards and animal performance, and we refer to herbal leys over here as multi-species swards. The work I'm presenting is a collaborative effort and it's multidisciplinary, and you know, these are just some of my colleagues who have collaborated in the work. And if you have any direct questions for me, you can avail of my email address, or you can get updates on our research work here at either of these 2 Twitter accounts if you so wish. So I'm not going to go into the challenges facing agriculture, we're all acutely familiar with those, but we think here that our herbal leys, our multi-species swards, you know, maybe one of the potential solutions to at least some of these challenges we're currently facing. And when we talk about multi-species swards, essentially we're referring to any sward that contains 2 or more varieties, or 2 or more species. But I would also just urge a little bit of caution in terms of the terminology here, because when we're talking about multi-species swards or herbal leys, it's very much used as a catch-all term. And actually you can get huge variation in the family referred to as multi-species swards or herbal leys. So the first picture I'm showing you here, that's a 12-species sward. Here we have a 6-species sward, which actually looks to be dominated pretty much by chicory and by perennial ryegrass. A 5-species sward here. And again, we have a 5-species sward in September, very much dominated by chicory. And that same 5-species sward the following March, where you can see there's much more grass and much less chicory present in the sward. So, you know, these are the swards are dynamic within themselves, within and across seasons. So very different to how we would maybe conventionally consider a sward being a grass-based or a perennial ryegrass-based sward. So about 5 or 6 years ago now, at this stage, I became involved in researching animal performance on multi-species swards, and my colleague, Professor Helen Sheridan, had been working with multi-species swards for a number of years in terms of their dry matter production potential and their agroeconomic values. And to be honest with you, I got involved with the work in the hope that the performance of animals grazing multi-species swards mightn't be too much below what we're achieving with our perennial ryegrass standards. So we set up a sheep-only grazing experiment consisting of 4 swards, and I just draw your attention to the colour coding here because this will continue throughout the next few slides. Our perennial ryegrass sward is denoted by red. Our perennial ryegrass and white clover sward is in blue. Our 6-species sward, which contained 2 grasses, 2 legumes and 2 herbs, is represented by green. And then our 9-species sward containing 3 grasses, 3 legumes and 3 herbs is represented in yellow. We stocked these swards quite highly. You know, the swards were stocked at 12.5 ewes per hectare, and each ewe was rearing 2 lambs. So potentially quite a high level of animal performance to be achieved from these swards if we got things right. And we started measuring a whole array of animal performance metrics. We looked at initially the effect of sward type on average daily gain from birth to 6 weeks. And again, a number of my slides will have the same layout. So the columns and the numbers in the background, they're the detailed data, and the red box in the foreground is really the message I'm trying to convey with the slide. So compared to a perennial ryegrass sward, lamb suckling ewes, which grazed the 6-species sward, had an 18% higher growth rate to 6 weeks of age. And interestingly, when we included any additional species in the mixture in addition to perennial ryegrass, we actually increased the growth rate of our lambs. And up to this point, the lamb performance is essentially entirely driven by the milk production and the milk quality produced by the lamb. As one might expect, those performance benefits we witnessed over the first 6 weeks, they continued right through until weaning time. The orange line running horizontally across this graph at 30 kilos, that is our target weaning weight for animals of this type in our grass-based production systems. And you can see that all our flocks grazing all our swards performed in excess of the target. But perhaps most interestingly, compared to a perennial ryegrass sward, lamb suckling ewes, which grazed the 6-species sward, had a 2.4 kilogram higher live weight at weaning compared to the lambs suckling the perennial ryegrass sward. Each ewe was rearing 2 lambs, so this is essentially an additional 5 kilos of lamb live weight weaned per ewe at 14 weeks of age. Post-weaning, interestingly, the lamb performances actually converged quite a lot, but we still, compared to a perennial ryegrass sward, lambs fed any mixed sward reached slaughter 2 weeks earlier. And this has the potential to have a feed, an economic, and even a carbon saving on farms by getting these animals ready for slaughter at an earlier age. And we produced the same quantity of carcass or the same carcass weight per lamb, and we actually achieved a higher kill-out percentage in the lambs grazing the multi-species swards. In terms of the amount of herbage grown to support this stocking rate of 12.5 ewes per hectare, on average across the treatments, we grew around 10 tonne of herbage dry matter per hectare. And the swards containing the 6-species mix and the 9-species mix, they grew equivalent or more herbage than the perennial ryegrass sward with 45% less fertilizer nitrogen applications. So again, we have an economic saving here in terms of the dry matter production of the swards. Perhaps some of the most interesting results we recorded with the multi-species sward revolved around the animal parasite burden we experienced on the swards and within the lambs grazing the swards. So all animals were dosed at 10 weeks of age to control a nematovirus outbreak, or really a forecasted nematovirus hatch, I should say. And then we recorded how many days elapsed between that first dose and the lambs requiring a second dose to control intestinal parasites. You can see with a perennial ryegrass treatment, that second dose or subsequent doses were coming around every 35 days. For perennial ryegrass and white clover is about every 42 days. For the 6 species mix, the additional dose wasn't required for 51 days, and for the 9 species mix, the additional dose wasn't required for about 58 days. So the interval from one dosing to the next was longer for lambs grazing multi-species swards. Over the lifetime then of the animals on that production system, compared to lambs grazing perennial ryegrass only swards, lambs grazing multi-species swards required 50% fewer drench administrations over their lifetime. And again, this has potential to have an economic saving. It will have a labour saving by reducing the frequency of drenching the flock, and also it will slow down the development of anthelmintic resistance within that parasite population within our flocks. Basically, every time we administer an anthelmintic drench to a sheep, we're increasing the risk and increasing the rate at which anthelmintic resistance develops within that parasite population. And this is one of the most exciting results, in my opinion, we've achieved from our multi-species or from our herbal lay grazing work to date. This slide now, it's a little bit busy and my colour scheme doesn't carry through here, but essentially we have 4 sets of 3 columns. We have 3 columns for perennial ryegrass and perennial ryegrass white clover and so on. The yellow line running horizontal across the graph represents the starting weight of the ewes on experiment over the 2-year period. And if you look at the 2 sets of columns to the right-hand side of the graph, you will see that ewes offered multi-species swards had higher live weights at all stages of the production cycle. And that actually translated through into higher litter size of the ewes grazing the 6 species and the 9 species mixture. So really, the point I'm trying to make here is our accelerated lamb growth rates and our improved lamb performance was not coming at the expense of ewe performance. Briefly, I'm going to diverge from the agenda a little bit and speak very quickly about cattle. Many of you probably have cattle as well at home, and cattle are certainly the larger part of our national agri-food industry here compared to sheep. So we established 3 swards again, essentially the first 3 swards I just described on the previous study: perennial ryegrass, white clover, and our 6 species multi-species sward. And we're grazing these animals with beef steers from the dairy herd. So when we look at the impact of sward type on the average daily gain of the beef steers during their first grazing season and their first winter, and these were calves which were turned out to this grazing system in June 2020, we can see again that our perennial ryegrass, white clover, and our multi-species swards are achieving much higher average daily gains than the calves grazing the perennial ryegrass only monoculture. So the benefits we're seeing in our sheep are also there present in our beef cattle. And then this graph, it shows the impact of sward type on average daily gain of those beef steers in the 2021 grazing season. So this data was just collected on Monday. And we can see here that the animals grazing the multi-species sward in this grazing season are growing about 300 grams per day faster than the animals grazing the perennial ryegrass sward. That means today, 12 months after they started grazing this system, the animals grazing the multi-species sward are 80 kilograms heavier than the animals grazing the perennial ryegrass sward, despite starting on the study at exactly the same live weight of approximately 130 kilograms. Interestingly, in this study with beef cattle, we're seeing improved dry matter yields on our multi-species swards, shown here in the green. But I would just urge a little bit of caution in terms of overinterpretation of this data, because it only represents 1 year's data, and we need to be careful in interpreting or over-extrapolating from 1 year of grazing studies. So then the final piece of data I will refer to is some work we're conducting with a commercial company here, Devonish Nutrition, which many of you will be familiar with. And they have recently established a research farm on their land in County Meath. And in this work, we're co-grazing cattle and sheep. we have established 4 sward types: a perennial ryegrass sward, an old permanent pasture, which is essentially the result of the management and the rather extensive management on that farm over the last 60 to 70 years, consisting of about 30 or 30 plus species. We again have our 6 species mixture, which to date is proving to be our most successful mixture, and a 12 species mixture containing additional grasses, legumes and herbs. When we look at the performance of the lambs in that co-grazing study, we can see that the average daily gain of these lambs from birth to slaughter really was exceptional, and in grazing systems, these are the highest lamb performances I have achieved in grazing systems here with sheep. But the lambs grazing the multi-species swards had a 24% higher average daily gain than animals grazing either the perennial ryegrass or the old permanent pasture from turnout in April until slaughter. Looking then at the impact of the sward type on the age of the lambs at slaughter, and again we're seeing benefits here from grazing lambs on multi-species swards. Lambs grazing multi-species swards were finished on average 4 weeks earlier than lambs grazing either perennial ryegrass or old permanent pasture. And again, as I've already stated, this is likely to have a feed, an economic and a carbon saving in this and in these particular production systems. We're currently in the process of collecting data on this study again this year, and we're seeing the exact same results arising where the 6 species and the 12 species swards are outperforming the 2 perennial ryegrass and the old permanent pasture system. Quickly to look at the effect of sward type again on the heifers in this study, and again we're seeing our 6 species sward are achieving the highest performance of any of the categories we've looked at, and the beef heifers grazing a 6 species mixture had a 13% higher average daily gain than animals grazing the perennial ryegrass or the old permanent pasture during their second summer of grass. And in this case, all the heifers were finished from pasture without any concentrate supplementation. And again, in this study with our colleagues in Devonish, we're seeing improved herbage dry matter production. And in this case, we're probably putting out about 35% of the fertilizer nitrogen on the multi-species swards compared to what the perennial ryegrass monoculture is achieving. And yet we're achieving higher dry matter production levels. So with that, I would just like to acknowledge and thank our collaborators and our funders for their support in this research work. And Jan, I'll attempt to answer any questions which may arise. Thank you very much.
That's great, Tommy. Thanks very much indeed for that. I think the plan was to leave questions until the end. I mean, enormous amount of information in there, and as ever, it's wonderful to see the Irish work going through to the farmlet level, which demonstrates very much to us farmers rather than just small plot stuff. Thanks, Tommy. We'll get to questions later. Our next speaker is James Small. James is a 3rd generation farmer and partner in Small Brothers, an extensive farm at 900 feet above sea level on Somerset's Mendip Hills overlooking the Cheddar Gorge. The farm has light soils over limestone, which in the piece of information I had, it says conversely makes it quite acidic. To me, it sounded as though it was perverse rather than converse, that it should have acidic soils over limestone. Currently, the farm carries 100 sucklers and 1,200 ewes, mainly Beulah and speckled faces, I think. These lambing in May. As well as a considerable area of extensive grazing, multi-species swards play an important role on the farm. With the upcoming changes in the agricultural support systems that are in all our minds really, the partners are currently reviewing their business as its geographical location has the potential to offer other opportunities. But I don't think it's those we're here to discuss, James, but feel free to make comments if necessary. Okay, well, over to you to get something about your experience with the multi-species sward.
Thank you very much, Jan. That's very kind of you. I just on the opening slide there, I just have that little photo there to give you an idea what it looks like at the bottom of our farm. So that is the Cheddar Gorge in Somerset. So our land runs around either side of it. just to give you an indication of some of the rough grazing that we have. Could we have the next slide, please? Okay, so there's just a little bit of background of what we're doing. Although the farm is fairly extensive, there's actually only a relatively around about a third of it or so that we can actually plowable and that we can utilize for multi-purpose. The reason that we really started to look at getting into this is we were actually approached in 2011 by FWAG and Somerset Wildlife Trust with regards to looking at a multi-species mix that could go into a field, actually become part of an EK21 option for the ELS, the agro-environmental scheme, which is a little bit why I got into that policy side of it. We got on with that quite well, and we'll see some of it as we go through in a moment. But what we were really keen to try to help out in terms that farms would have something that they could do that was utilizable, commercial, but also gain something in terms of the agro-environmental schemes. We currently have around about 50 acres of multi-species mix in at the moment. I don't think that we would have much more than that in at any one time, principally because of some of the trickiness in terms of managing it that we found, which we'll come on to in a little bit. And as I say at the bottom, we still haven't got it right, and I doubt that we ever will, because we're constantly learning all the time. Can we have the next slide, please? So originally, we had quite a variety of mixes that were in there. This is the one that was put in as part of the trial. Now, we've actually dropped some of these things, so that we're down to around about sort of 12 species in some of the mixes that we got. And they will actually, we found some of them will decline at different points. So a couple of our leys have been in now for about 8-9 years. They're rolling on okay, but the species content in them has declined. So that we're probably just down to grasses with a few clovers. Chicory survives quite well, and some of the plantains are sticking in there quite well. One of the things that always I get asked about is how much expensive is it going to be? Now, I'm not going to answer that because price volatility at the moment is probably on all of our mind, but seems to run away with us at times. But certainly speak to your local supplier. It's surprising what mixes are available out there. And with the work that's been going on now, some of which we're here tonight, there is actually a lot of choice that you can have, but don't get carried away with thinking you've got to have lots and lots of things in there. I think dipping your toe in the water and seeing how you get on is a great start to this. Could we move on to the next slide, please? So for us, establishment is really around the whether you do autumn or spring. Now, this is going to depend greatly upon your own management system. Our first establishment went into the autumn, and we did actually plough over. We set it as a proper crop, and I think you've got to start thinking about this as a proper crop. You can't you can't do half a job on it. You really do have to treat this as a complete reseed. Our first one actually went in at around about the 29th of September. Now, for various reasons on the farm here, principally around the amount of ground that was tied up, we actually wanted to move to a spring establishment. Now, when we went to spring establishment, it was okay. We got it into the ground, but we started to find that we had quite a lot of weed inundation into it. So thistles, bull thistle, creeping thistle came in and caused us some real problems. Now, a snag that we have is that there isn't really much in the way of chemical control that you can have in these mixed crops. Anything that's going to tackle the thistle is unfortunately going to take out quite a bit of your target species. So we've started to look at a different way of managing this now, in terms that we're actually putting in at different points various plants. So the first reseed, we will put in a straight grass lane. We will then see what pokes its head up in terms of any particular weed species that may come in. And then following on from that, and if we need to spray in the autumn, we will then look at putting in an overseeding with more of a herbal mix. So we're not actually buying it as a complete thing in a bag. We're actually splitting what we're using. It does create a bit of added cost, but there's nothing worse than spending the money on putting this lay in and then not actually having the target species that you want out in the field. We're doing this slightly because we're changing. We're going into a new contract arrangement where we're actually growing cereals to try to produce a bit more straw for the cattle. We'll then harvest that in the August. We'll then go into a forage crop for feeding lambs on, with then the herbal lay going in, or the grass part of it in the spring, with the herbal part coming in into the following autumn. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So to cut or graze. Obviously, the focus here tonight is really around the grazing side of it with sheep, and it's only my 10 pennies worth, but I think really for the first season, you need to allow the crop to establish, which would actually mean leaving it in there and taking 1 or 2 cuts off of it. We've always found the sheep to be quite selective, and if on a new lay you put them in, which we have trialled, we do find that they tend to target some species more than others in the way that we manage it. So for the first season, we will allow it to grow up, to come on. We'll take 1 or 2 cuts off of it, either for silage or hay. We'll put that back separate because we do find it to be much more palatable than standard ryegrass. And we will use that either for our finishing lambs or for our rearing store cattle. In terms of cutting, you just treat it like any other crop. One of the conditions we had in the first trial plot that we did is it had to have been left for a 3-week period just after mid-May until the beginning of June. Now, if you're growing it for your commercial reason, that doesn't matter. But if it's as part of maybe a stewardship agreement as an infield option, that's probably still there. It's not for us now at the moment. We don't receive any payments on this from agri-environmental side of it, so we can still pretty much do what we like with it, although we do still plant it as part of the commercial operation. If we could go to the next slide, please. So once it is established, and so this is a 3-year-old lay here, you can see we've got quite a variety of oxeye daisy in the photo to the left, and we got some of the chicory coming through quite strong there on the one to the right. This is, again, we will have allowed this to come on for making hay. So we would have grazed ewes on it just up into the spring. We would have shut it up. This would have been taken in June. Once cut, we will then close the field back up again, and we'll use it for putting lambs onto post-weaning, which will be around about mid-September for us. We don't tend to do any set stocking with it. We'll put lambs in onto the grass as we see fit as to what we think the grazing is there. The lambs will then stay and rotate through on there until probably November, December time, and when we'll start drawing on them in terms of finished animals or indeed stores, just depending as to what the market is for us. So we like to have a bit of flexibility and availability in what we're doing. We don't like to really tie ourselves down to one thing. One thing we have noticed, if the picture on the right with the chicory quite strong, again, the sheep, when we're grazing on that, can be really selective, and they'll get their noses down in the bottom and we're left with the stalks. Now, how you manage that, the way we've done it, tended to be either we would top it to take it down, and then allow it to come back up. So take it down at a fairly high top rate, but still to take the tops off of those plants. And then the sheep will then carry on grazing with it. Yes, they love going in there when it's fairly high, but we found that there does tend to be quite a high amount of wastage with that. If we could go to the next photo, please. Now, I just put this one in just as a little bit of an interesting point. So you're looking at the same piece of land, but in 2 different directions. So this was from the original plot that we did, an 8-acre field. This was next to a triple SI, so yes, it was important that we had it in there. It was part of the scheme. But the perception or the perceived wisdom is that, well, if you leave these crops to germinate and to flower, then it'll be even better the following year. So full of this figure, I left a 6-meter strip next to the triple SI there, which you can see in the slide to the left. The following year, it's the same patch but taken from a different angle. You can see that actually the population density in there has dropped dramatically. So actually managing this crop is really important. If you think that leaving it in just allowing it to grow will make a stronger crop, it won't. It actually responds quite well to the management and to the cutting. And once it is established, you can actually treat it quite hard. But it does respond better, I think, to probably mob grazing as opposed to set stocking. Certainly for us, that's where we started to find the problem, in terms of if we left sheep in there for too long, they would take out those target plants, and you're left with, yeah, you've still got a grass lay, but you are not getting the multi-species that you really want or need in there. But it was just a matter of interest just to see how that works, and lesson learned. We won't do that again. with the grazing regimes coming in, we're finding that the lamb grazing through the winter benefits us well. Deferred grazing on it is okay, but you do still need to be closing it up quite in readiness, the same as any other crop, if you're planning on making any sort of forage crop from it. Otherwise, once it's established, yes, you can keep it down and to keep grazing it pretty robustly. It will respond, it will grow actually really well. So I have no fears about that now with any future lays that we're putting in. Once I'm over the establishment part, and it's the establishment bits that's giving me the headache at the moment. Again, we're still particularly learning on this. So once it's in there, it's fine. You'll get, I think, 6 to 8 years out of a lay reasonably well, but you might want to be thinking 5 to 6 lays, depending on what sort of species mix you're wanting to keep in there. And of course, also depending on cost benefit. We found direct drilling not to be the best way. That's our personal experience. So it does tend to be inversion, which does lead to a higher cost, and so therefore not something we want to be doing too often. If we could go to the last slide, please. Okay, this has very little to do with herbal grazing, but I just thought that has this really sheepy content of viewers here tonight. You might be interested to see 900 ewes walking their way back to home just for their Hectare pre-lambing. So they're coming back from a bit of deferred grazing that we had. We do have a drone, so we do have a little play with that sometimes. And so just as a little bit of an impact shot, you also get a bit of an idea in the background there of the type of terrain that we're on here. So it is quite hard ground indeed, as Jan said in the first start. And these lays have performed here. So I don't have any problems or fears about that. If you're thinking of having a go with it, then absolutely do so. But do go in with your eyes open, treat it as a crop, and the very best of luck with it. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, James. That was excellent. And a very nice picture there at the end. Tempted to ask whether you used a drone to drive the sheep with. Okay, to move on to the third of our speakers this evening, it's Angus MacKay. Angus is a partner in Simmons Hyde Farm in Hertfordshire, a mixed farm growing combinable crops, whilst the relatively new sheep enterprise added 5 years ago in 2016 produces prime lamb for Tesco. Grazed herbal leys have been introduced to improve the resilience of the arable soils and to improve the overall profitability of the business. Angus has also recently started selling a small number of lambs through an online box scheme. And probably having had a sneak preview of the slides, I believe is some very interesting figures on both per annum and per hectare lamb output from a range of different forages. Hope I'm not preempting what you're going to say. So no pressure then, Angus. Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jan. That was a lovely introduction. So yeah, my father and I farm at Simon's Hyde Farm, which is in Hertfordshire, just off A1M, over in what we like to call the dry east. We get about 700 mil of rain every year. On average, some years obviously it's less. Last year it was less. But recently our weather has been characterised by very dry spells, we would call very dry spells in the spring. So in 2020 we had nearly 6 weeks with no rain. In 2021 we had 5 weeks with no rain, no recordable rain for March and April. Obviously that's a key growing period, both for us on the arable side where we're trying to establish spring crops, and also for the sheep side where we're trying to grow good grass to rear lambs on. So we're increasingly trying to focus on having a grazing platform that's resilient to these extreme variable weathers and will produce reliable fodder. So just to give you a bit of overall background, we produce just under 1,000 hectares of combinable crops, focused mainly on cereals and particularly on wheat, Group 3 soft wheat, going into either bread or and then, yeah, as Jan said, in 2016 we added the sheep enterprise onto the side of that arable enterprise, which has grown fairly rapidly. So this year we're grazing about 240 hectares of grass, 1,300 ewes. We keep all our lambs through to fat, or aim to keep all our lambs through to fat. and as Jan says, sell them into supermarkets. Historically, we have been a purely grass-based system. Some of our leys have a small amount of white clover in them, but mostly based around perennial ryegrasses. With variable weather and low rainfalls, it hasn't performed that well, and we've accepted lower spring-summer growth rates with the idea that we'll grow large areas of stubble turnips on arable land where we've got a spring crop going in, and we can grow stubble turnips in front of it, and really aim to keep lambs through the spring and summer, and then really pattern them very rapidly through and early into the following year, which works quite well where prices rise. But we felt that there was an opportunity to fatten lambs earlier and potentially look at buying in on stubble turnips if that worked. So last autumn, we planted 40 hectares of a lucerne chicory red clover ley. So it's a grassless mix, just those 3 species in it. It established moderately well across the areas. It was a very wet winter. 8 hectares of it has failed to establish sufficiently, but everything else is established well enough to create a grazable crop this year. And really, it's that grazable crop that I was hoping to focus on today, because I think it's a bit different. So could we go to the next slide? And I just thought I'd talk through some of our thoughts behind how we'd make the finances of it stack up. So we're taking land out of arable production and putting it into a grazing ley, and what level of rent we might be able to pay, and what sort of return we might expect from the land, and how do we maximise profitability per hectare across the whole arable rotation, which would be a sort of 8-year arable rotation. So what we were looking at was 6 years of arable production and then 2 years of this lucerne chicory clover mode. So the profitability for us is going to be driven by lamb performance. We were thinking if we could get lambs to grow at 350 grams a day, which is for us a pretty strong growth rate, and if we could manage 56 lambs a hectare, which is obviously fairly strong stocking rate. We chose that 56 lambs a hectare because it's 2.3 livestock units, and we thought that was just a little bit less than 2.5. Sort of Bolden. So if we could manage those 2 figures above 350 grams a day and 56 lambs a hectare, we'd be producing just under 20 kilos a hectare a day of saleable sheep meat. We put that in a budget at £2 a kilo, and it would be, so that's worth £40 a hectare a day. If we could manage that over a 150-day grazing window, over a 5-month grazing window, that'd be nearly £6,000 of income, which starts to get quite an exciting sort of income. It'd be a similar level of income to a few beef trials we've looked at, where they're fattening beef, which gave us a bit of hope that maybe it is possible. So yeah, we thought at that sort of level it would be feasible to incorporate a 2-year ley, which would have various benefits for the arable side and also for the sheep side, which we'll come on to in a minute. So the second question was, is that 350 grams a day, is that a feasible stocking rate? Can we produce enough fodder to feed that? So if we put lambs on there at an average of 30 kilos and they're consuming 4% of their body weight, they need 1.2 kilos a day of dry matter intake. We've got 56 of them on every hectare, so we'd need just under 70 kilos a day of feed going into those lambs off each hectare, which over 30 days is about 2 tonne. And if we're grazing for 5 months, then that's 10 tonnes over the growing season, which we didn't feel was an unachievable yield from a sort of relatively short-term mix of rapid growing species. So we thought probably the yield is there to drive the performance if we can get the sheep to perform. Just a sort of interesting sort of side note, we thought if our lambs are eating 1.2 kilos or 1,200 grams a day food, and they're putting on 350 grams a day of live weight, that's a feed conversion ratio of 3.4 to 1, which is quite strong. I think historically sheep have been thought to grow possibly quite a lot than that. But there are 1 or 2 studies that suggest that that sort of level of feed conversion is possible, which again, we hope that maybe this whole plan would come together. It will be, you know, it is a really high quality feed. It's completely worm-free ground. We've farmed on this farm for 15 years. Certainly while we've been here, it's not been in grass, and the previous 2 contractors after we had no livestock. So we were talking 20+ years with no livestock and no grass. So we should be producing the very highest quality feed, and we thought if it went well, maybe we would convert. Obviously, we've only talked about income so far. The mix is quite an expensive one to grow. Where it falls into the rotation, we're looking at keeping it for 2 years or possibly 3 if we really had to. If we start putting it out to a 3-year mix, you're starting to lose slots for first wheat on the arable side, which is a very profitable crop. So we were keen to try and keep it down to 2 years, which means you've got to spread all your establishment costs over 2 years, which could be 80 quid a hectare for the sort of tractoring work, if you like, establishing it. And then the seed mix is going to cost you 80 quid a hectare plus, depending on what you want to put into it. So you could be 160 to 200 quid a hectare establishment cost, would be 100 quid a hectare. So there are I suppose what I'm trying to make is that there are costs associated with it. But we thought if we can drive those levels of land performance, then those costs will be a little more than pay off. So if we go to the next slide, I was just going to talk about one particular field where we're doing this and how we've got on with it. So as you can see in these photos, it's quite different to things we've grazed in the past. It's been an incredibly good growing season here, I think, as it has across much of the country, and we've got far more fodder than we have had ever since we started keeping feed. And some areas have got away from us quite a lot, as you can see from the picture at the bottom there in the middle. So just working around the pictures from top left, sort of in an anti-clockwise direction. At the top there, you can see us moving sheep from a grazed cell into an ungrazed cell across the temporary electric fence that we've got set up. That's the grazed cell we've probably grazed down a little bit harder than we would have perhaps liked. But I wanted to include the picture because the cell they're moving onto on the left is kind of the level we were hoping to sort of keep this mix at. The picture underneath that, so that's bottom left, that shows the residual where we've moved off a grazed cell. Again, that's the same cell in the top one, and it's probably a little bit grazed, slightly more hard than we perhaps liked. We were probably there 6 hours late, maybe something like that. I like the picture though because it illustrates the level of trampling. James talked about the chicory stems not being palatable. We found that they will get sort of trampled in, and in a sort of mob grazing way, we like the idea of them sort of feeding the soil, and it does seem to work, stimulating to regrow and build more yield again. Moving across to the middle at the bottom, this was an area of chicory that had got wildly out of hand. It's probably nearly 10 foot tall. They are actually ewes, you can see in the photo, not lambs. This is when we started grazing in, we've been grazing for a couple of weeks, so we're in sort of mid-June. We're grazing with ewes, with lambs at foot. It looks very different out there now. They've actually grazed out a lot of those stems, and the whole thing is becoming a much more sort of sustainable. And then the picture on the right, and then the middle at the top, I just wanted to sort of illustrate what it sort of looked like. Different, although it's got lucerne, chicory, and clover in it. Originally, we were going to have different fields of traits, like so a field of lucerne, a field of chicory, and a field of red clover. The conditions at establishment were difficult, and we were concerned that one species may not suit one part of the field, and it may not establish very well. And we weren't sure how the lucerne was going to get on growing over what could be a really wet winter. So in the end, we chucked it all in and built a mix, which has worked really well. I'm really glad we did that. It means that we've established across the whole field, and it means that the sheep are getting a much more varied diet, which I think actually is very important. It was illustrated by our first speaker. It's still very early days for us. Obviously, on a wider sheep point of view, we've only been grazing sheep for about 5 years, and then on these sort of leys, we've obviously only started in June time this year. So it's quite early days for us. we haven't got a huge amount of data yet about how well the sheep are growing. In fact, we've only got 2 weeks. We've only got 2 weighings, 2 weeks apart. I was hoping to get another weighing today, but I got there in the end. But over the 2 weighings that we have got, they have grown up almost exactly 350 grams a day, which is really pleasing. We're really pleased with that. So far, it seems to be on track, or just about anyway. Where we're establishing this onto arable land, there is absolutely no infrastructure. I really liked James's last picture, moving the sheep up the road with nice fences on either side. We have tried moving sheep on the road down here, but there is no hedges and there is no fences. So it takes a lot of manpower to sort of keep them roughly where you want them. And in field situations like we've got here, it's all behind temporary wrapper electric fencing, which works well as long as there's not too much vegetation talking out the fence, where you're a little bit late grazing it and it gets really tall. So we have ended up adapting our lawnmower to mow under the fence so that we can mow out the fence lines and keep the fence running nice and get out. We have had problems with getting out where the fence hasn't been running hot enough and they've got used to getting out, and then they're a bit of a nightmare. Providing water for them is obviously also a big issue, particularly in the recent heat wave. We have IBCs set up in sort of quarters between different cells so that we can move the trough relatively easily from one cell to the next, if that makes sense. And then we have another IBC on a trailer, say behind a Land Rover with a little petrol pump to refill the IBCs, which works quite well. We graze quite a lot of temperature situations, so it's something that we're relatively well adapted to, or are getting better at anyway. One of the big drivers behind putting these leys in was grazing out blackgrass, which is a big problem for us on the arable side. And they do seem to have preferentially grazed out the heads of the blackgrass and also the chicory stems. I suspect because they're a little bit short on fibre, and they're looking for that fibre, blackgrass and the chicory, which is great. That works really, really well for us. Our plan on these leys is to finish grazing them in September and then leave them for September and then over the winter, and we'll graze them again late May onwards. That'll allow the plants to flower and just build up some root reserve so they're ready to get through the winter. I'm conscious of time, so I'll just say a couple of bits comparing it to grass. We also graze grass, obviously, under traditional or rotational grazing. For us, though, there's big benefits in not growing grass in arable situations. We've got problems where we've ploughed out grass and gone back into arable crops, and we've got resistant ryegrass from the ley, which is incredibly hard to control in the arable crops. And we hope that a legume-based ley like this will be a really good entry for wheat. It should be building some nitrogen. It should be building a lot of organic matter into the soil and really helping us to start in terms of the damage we've done to arable soils over the last years. I'll leave it there, if that's all right. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Angus, and to all of our speakers for sharing your experience. I'll briefly highlight some upcoming events. So AHDB with BGS and LOC have an event coming up in September, and then the National Sheep Association also has a Southeastern Region Sheep Health, Welfare and Production Conference in October. So the web address is there to keep up to date. And for BGS updates, head over to britishgrassland.com. And finally, we have a new webpage for all things grass and forage at AHDB. So we have more grassland activity coming up over the next few months. So to find out more and get involved, keep an eye on our AHDB grass page for updates. So we'll now move into the Q&A, and we've got quite a few questions for you all already. So Tommy, if you're there, the first one is for you.
Yeah, Chloe, can you hear me?
Brilliant. Yes, we can hear you. That's great. Thank you. So the first one, Tommy, is how much more expensive are the mixed species boards to establish, and was there an end cost benefit with the improved land performance that you saw?
Yeah, so in terms of the cost of establishing the swards, the seed mixtures we used in the sheep grazing studies were actually a lower cost than the seed mixtures we used for the perennial ryegrass monoculture. The establishment costs were the same in terms of ploughing, tilling, sowing, or direct drilling. We always use the same establishment technique within a particular trial. We saved on the fertilizer application, we saved on that helmintics. And when we actually modelled those costings in any given year, it was cheaper to use the multi-species swards compared to perennial ryegrass monoculture. And we did some scenario modelling on that, and the results are starting to come out now at this stage, Chloe. But even if we had to reseed, do a full reseed every 3 years with the multi-species sward, we were still having the same level of profitability compared to a perennial ryegrass monoculture. So I think, you know, the additional cost is sometimes overplayed in terms of the seed mixtures here. And as some of the other speakers have indicated, you know, a more complex mixture doesn't mean necessarily a more expensive mixture.
Thank you, Tommy. Thank you for explaining that one. James, I'll move on to you for the next question that's come in. Which plant species were your sheep selectively grazing, please?
Oh, right, okay. So they were principally hitting out a lot of the herb and the wildflowers. So that's what we were finding. So the chicory is quite robust. That would stand up to as big plant, as we've seen there in some of Angus's photos as well. That would stand up to it. But because of the trial mix that we're in, we also had burnet, yarrow, sheep's parsley, ribgrass, lesser knapweed, and common sorrel. They pretty much took them out just because they were just that much more of a delicate plant. So really what we're after, I think, you know, in our future lays, we're keeping the legumes in, the clovers, the sandthorns, the trefoil, and we keep the chicory and the plantains in, but those other ones, we're just not even bothering planting them, so we don't bother having them in the mix.
Yeah.
It's great that the sheep love them, that's marvellous, but yeah, we can't afford to lose them that quick.
Thanks, James. And Tommy, is that a pattern you've seen in your trial work as well?
Yes, like I suppose our most successful mix that we've tried to date is the 6 species mixture, and when we've went in with additional herbs or additional legume over and above that, we haven't seen a benefit in terms of animal performance, and it has made that seed mixture a little bit more expensive. And not prohibitively so, but it has made it a little bit more expensive. And we tend to graze ours, you know, relatively intensively, high stocking rates, and you know they're stocked over small areas for short periods of time and rotated out. And the 6 species mixture does seem to have been the best we've had thus far to stand up to that. Now I will say we have no long-term persistency studies completed to date under sheep grazing. It is something we're working on at the moment, but we don't know how well they persist over 5 or 6 years under our particular grazing managements.
Okay, thank you. The next question, Angus, I'll start with you. How are you grazing your lay, please, in terms of how often are you moving the sheep, and are you measuring entry and exit covers? Because we know that plate meters won't measure the lays. So how are you dealing with that?
So to come to the first part of the question first, our aim was to set the field up with cells that would, if we moved every 3 to 4 days, would give us a 30-day rotation. So 10 cells field days between grazing and again. It's not quite as scientific as that, because sometimes the grass, because sometimes it's very much quicker. So you end up not making it back to the beginning. However, we've got sheep on grass as well. So if we feel like we're getting behind, then we just pop up. If we feel like we're getting a bit ahead, then we just. So it's just a little bit stuck in the sea. And then to come to the second part of your question, you're right. Plate meters don't really bring anything to the party. What we're really looking for is that they haven't grazed out any of the crowns of the plants that grow. If you graze out the growing point of chicory, red clover, it won't come back. And trying to move them before we think they need moving, so that we never get to a situation where they're being grazed.
Thank you. And James, have you any further comments to add to that? Would that be the same for you?
I'm afraid we're not as advanced as that in terms of our grazing, so we tend to be a bit more set stocking. And yeah, I mean, the key is to move them a little bit before you actually think they need to be moved. But due to our field sizes, we tend to be a little bit limited with what we're doing, and we're just looking at changing that in the future. It's all part of the mix as to what we're looking at doing. But definitely, yeah, when you think they need moving, you're a little bit too late, just a bit before then.
Thanks, James. And has anyone experienced issues with scold with grazing them quite tall? Angus, you mentioned that there was quite a lot of stem in that last photo of yours.
Yeah, we have had issues with scold, where it's been really wet, particularly actually on leys with a bit of grass in them. With tall stemmy grass, it's been a much bigger problem than on our grassless leys. I suspect that the chicory stems are too big to get between the cloves and the leaves, and yeah, it's something we do see.
Thank you. And Tommy, whilst we're on health issues, looking at your anthelmintic data, did the perennial ryegrass ley have ewes and lambs on it in the previous year, or was that a new ley as well?
No, that was a new ley as well, so they're all established. So in any of the experiments, all the swards have been established at the same time, with the exception of that work in Devonish with the old permanent pasture. Obviously, that wasn't established as an old permanent pasture, but that had been grazed by sheep for the previous 30 to 40 years, as far as we were aware.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for clarifying that.
The initial parasite inoculation came from the ewes in the post turnout period, as we don't dose adult ewes here on our farm.
Okay, yeah, brilliant, thank you. James, we've got one here for you. Have you considered creating a stale seed bed for establishment?
We've tried all sorts of things over the last few years, and there's a few other things that go into the mix with it. So we've tried spraying off and just creating and direct drilling into that. We seem to have a bit of an acidic problem, and that seems to cause some issues with the seed, with what we've done with that particular trial. So what we're looking at the moment is, as I say, with the straw production that we're looking at, so the cereal crop going in, the way that we're hoping also to try to rectify, we tend to be very low in phosphates here. So, you know, this isn't a crop you just stick in the ground. You do have to actually rectify as well and make sure that your P and Ks are all up there. That's an expensive hobby. So we're trying to use the cereal option to help with that. And then that will be creating us our seed bed following on from it to be able to put these in. We hope in a more clean and a slightly more nutritional seed bed. So I said we've tried all sorts. We've tried direct drilling, we've tried broadcasting, we've tried ordinary conventional drill, air drill, all sorts of different things, and we haven't quite got it right yet. But we do know that inversion, complete plough over and set seems to work the best for us here with a fairly high rainfall.
Thanks, James. Tommy, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with essentially everything James has said there. Our best success has been with a full plough till sow, and we have done sterile seed bed in the past, and it has worked very, very well for us. And absolutely, in terms of your other soil fertility parameters, in terms of your pH, your Ps, and indeed your Ks, you know, they need to be correct, or just like with any reseeding initiative, they need to be correct, or you're not going to get the maximum return from your efforts.
Thanks, Tommy. Angus, I'll start with you. We've got a question here. Has anyone experienced issues with bloat at all?
Bloat was obviously a big concern we had putting sheep onto it. We have had sheep die of bloat in the past. With one of the first batches of ewe lambs we brought onto farm, we shut them up 24 hours in the yard, Zolvix them so they could rid all their worms. But we've done exactly the right thing, put them out onto a ryegrass clover ley. About the next 10, 5 of them tried bloat. But so we were sort of aware of it. We made sure they'd had a good feed before they went out there, so they were nice and full. And touch wood, it's been fine so far. I think ensuring that they don't themselves when they go on. I probably wouldn't want to put them on a lorry for 7 hours and then put them out. There might be issues there.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Tommy, if I can come to you, we've just got a question here about your leys that were 6 to 9 species. How many years did they last, please?
Yeah, well, the way we work is very different from a commercial farm, unfortunately. So we have to apply to our research farm for the use of resources for a fixed period of time. So that particular, we had the use of that part of the farm for 3 years. Okay. So at the end of the 3 years, those swards were actually ploughed up and put into another study. But we were seeing a deterioration in the chicory in particular, and to a lesser extent the plantain in those swards, even at the end of the 3-year grazing period. I would say that we probably didn't graze them in that study optimally for the herb. We were grazing down to 4 centimetres, which is very, very, very hard on the herbs, particularly the chicory. It's depleting its root reserve and its regrowth after each grazing event. Since then, we've increased our post-grazing sward height to about 6 centimetres, and we do at least appear to be getting a little bit better persistency of the herbs in the swards over the limited duration we have to date. When visiting New Zealand and other places where they'd be looking at herb legume swards with no grass, they'd be looking at taking their animals out of those swards at about a 10 centimetre residual. So that's over their work, that has been the optimum for the survival and persistency of the herbs over time. But the chicory and the plantain, which are 2 herbs we would have the most experience here with, they're not going to persist. At least I don't believe they persist in the sward for 10, 12, 15 years. And if we're getting 4 to 5 good years from them, I think that's probably towards the upper limit of where we're going to achieve under sheep grazing.
Okay, thanks, Tommy. And James, do you have any comments on that? How long have yours been staying in for?
Yes, I mean, the way that just the way that we do it on the reseeding, generally they're in for anywhere from 6 to 8 years. I would agree. And the photo I showed, there was a 3-year-old lay. It's still quite. It was quite abundant in terms of the species diversity within it. Once you get to about year 5, it's really dropping off. So then it's a matter of whether you're wanting to keep the herbal mix going in there, because we had the grasses there. Actually, we continued it on as a more of a grassier type lay, with the herb mixes going into different fields. So it's just the way that it worked in with us. But yes, it can last a longer time, but you're not going to get the diversity of mix there. Really, its optimum is in the first 3, maybe 4 years. That's your prime.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. I'm just conscious of time. We'll squeeze in a couple more and then we'll have to wrap up for this evening. Has anyone got any comments on what works best for controlling weeds, please? And I know, James, you had some very helpful top tips. I'll come to you, Angus, to see what your thoughts are.
So lucerne, chicory, clover leys were put in blackgrass, a weed that we're really struggling to control on the arable side. And the pure sort of productivity of the lay, shading that blackgrass out, coupled with the sheep grazing it out, has worked really well. The blackgrass appears to be, that's good. We see big problems with thistles, which we haven't really found a solution for yet. In grass, we'd spot spray them out or go in with a weed wiper. In lucerne, chicory, clover leys, that's not really quite so easy. So yeah, they're not. It's not a vast population. It's been an arable production for many years, and there's lots of reasons to control it. But they are a weed of concern that we don't know.
Thanks, Angus. And Tommy, do you have any comments on that? What have you been seeing over those 3 years?
Yeah, I would agree. The biggest problem we've had in any of our swards we've established on the various sites over the various experiments have been thistles on one particular site. And we did do weed wiping in that case to control the thistle, and it worked quite well. And then we did have to come back in with a second round of spot spraying, but we essentially eliminated with that approach. But the big bottleneck here is we don't have herbicides to control what we consider weeds in these multi-species swards. So it's trying to get on top of much of that problem in advance of setting the seed that we possibly can. And to be honest with you, we've found probably some of our best results in terms of low weed infestations and low weed burdens with ground coming out of tillage for the preceding 4 or 5 years, where we've gone into old pasture swards. There's quite a big seed bank in that soil, and that's where we ran into trouble with our thistles.
Okay.
Sorry, just one final brief comment. Some work that some of my colleagues are doing here, both in UCD and in Teagasc, would actually show that the multi-species swards are actually more resistant to weed infestation than ryegrass monocultures. The problem being where you do get weeds in a multi-species sward, you can't do a blanket application of herbicide, and that option is obviously available in a perennial ryegrass sward.
Thank you, Tommy. We'll have to keep up to date with that research as it comes through.
Could I just add another comment to that, Chloe, as well?
Yeah, sure.
We were looking at growing straight swords, and we were looking at a pure lucerne sward. One of the benefits we saw in that was that potentially you could, if you're feeling brave, spray it with a low rate of Roundup, which killed the lucerne and would. But if it doesn't work, you didn't hear it from me.
You just broke up a bit there, Angus. So did you say a low rate of Roundup?
That's probably a good job, Chloe.
Yeah, in theory, the lucerne will be dormant and will be resilient to the Roundup. So you should be able to get away with it, but it's not something we've actually done.
Well, maybe we'll let you try it first, Angus, and then we'll come back. We just had one final question for this evening, and James, I'll come to you because you had some lovely photos of them in flower. Do we need to allow the plants to flower every year?
I think that's going to come down to what you want to do with the management of your crop. If you're in an agro-environmental scheme, then yes, you probably are going to. If you're doing it on a purely commercial basis, then actually you're just wanting that plant growth coming up, and you're trying to graze it before it gets to that stage, probably to keep the plant forcing on, as you would with most other crops. We were obviously looking at for the scheme, so we wanted the flowering element to get in there. Probably most crops you wouldn't want the flowers in there in the first place, really, of the types we had. So it looked pretty, but may not necessarily be what you want.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, thank you very much all for answering those questions. We've got as many as we can this evening. I'll hand over to Tom to wrap up this evening's webinar.
Okay, thanks, Chloe. Well, fantastic. Just over an hour's worth of discussion there. So much ground covered. Lots of information. Just to pick up on a couple of points, so Tommy, you mentioned how dynamic the swards are, both within sort of the species within the how across the season as well, and also the fantastic trial work as well that you summarised in terms of performance and the opportunities there to look at reducing the number of drenches, and also the opportunities there to help in terms of the cost in terms of feed economic and carbon saving. So yeah, really great work there. James, yeah, it was really great to see what you're up to. I think tenacity is definitely your is key to your system there. I was that you've tried different things and you're trying to work through to find the best option there to make it work, and particularly in terms of establishment, trying to get that seems to be just trying to pin down for each farm it might be slightly different in terms of the best way to get the crop established. It was interesting in terms of them you're talking in terms of staggering the establishment, but putting the grass in first and then coming behind with the different species. Angus, your attention to detail was clearly obvious in terms of the figures that you've got there and the budgeting, and it was great to see, and it was really great to see that also the measurements then you're doing following is checking that budgeting was right, and everything seems to be coming together. So that's really great to see, and also how it's fitting into the wider system and the benefits you hopefully be seeing then in terms of building the soil and the benefits that'll have in terms of the arable system as well. So they were 3 excellent presentations. It was really fantastic. There'll be recordings available on the AHDB website, and we'll have links on the BGS website to those, and I'm sure the NSA as well will have links through to those recordings as well. So just to finish off, I'd finally like just to thank Tommy, James and Angus for their time this evening. It was really fantastic discussion. I'd also like to thank Chloe for facilitating tonight and asking the questions, and also to Katie and Jan from the NSA for your input as well during the evening and also in the planning to the event. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll draw it to a close there.
Thank you.
Thank you.